Benjamin Bryce is a historian of migration in the Americas with a particular focus on both Argentina and Canada. In addition to teaching as an assistant professor in the University of British Columbia's History Department, he is also chair of the Latin American Studies program and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Canadian Historical Association. We will be discussing his monograph, To Belong in Buenos Aires, published by Stanford University Press in 2018. So, Dr. Bryce, how are you?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Okay. How did you come into the field of history? What made you want to research Germans in Buenos Aires?
The first question, how I came into history, I was an undergraduate. I really took to history in grade 11. I remember I had a very good history teacher in grade 11 who then, she was a social studies teacher in grade 11, and then it was a history class in grade 12. And so I really liked history. So when I came to university, I thought I was going to major in history, but then very quickly got interested in political science, and then sort of a related field, we called it at my university, international relations, which was a bit history, a bit political science. So I then thought I was going to be instead majoring in those things, but then very quickly reverted back to history. So it's kind of been not a plan, but been a consistent thing since grade 11, and then undergraduate, and then my master's degree was in history, and obviously my PhD as well. For the topic of Germans in Buenos Aires, how I got into that, I'd say it's fairly personal, not in that it's not a family history, but so when I was 17, after graduation, I spent a year in Argentina as a Rotary exchange student. So I got interested in Argentina. I got interested in Argentine history. I remember reading, I have a vivid memory of reading encyclopedias to sort of get crash courses in various topics of Argentine history. And so I was interested in Argentina as an undergraduate. I did a minor in Latin American studies. I went to Columbia then after my second year of university. So I was just interested in Latin American and Argentine history. But then I also was interested in going to other places and got interested in Germany. And so actually after my BA, I spent a bit more than a year, first in Schleswig-Holstein and then in Berlin, teaching in German schools as part of this exchange program run by the German federal government. So then I was in Germany, and I was thinking about what do I do next in life. And I came up with a master's proposal, which took advantage of my interests and skills, which was both speaking Spanish and German, and this interest in Germany and Argentina is like two places where I was intrigued in histories. And so the sort of maybe the logical project that came to mind was a study of migration. And so I got into this topic of German migration to Argentina through that kind of personal trajectory.
I'm going to do the typical Germanist question of, are you German?
I'm not German. No, I have no German background. No, there's this idea in Spanish about my 8 last names. You know, my grandparents' 2 last names. None of my 8 last names are German. No, it was only I was interested in Germany, and I already spoke Spanish and French when I arrived in Germany. And because of that, I think in particular, I did quite well with the German language. And so just got into Germany and got good at German, spoke Spanish and French when I arrived in Germany. And because of that, I think in particular, I did quite well with the German language. And so just got into Germany and got good at German. And so it's a very just acquired interest.
Okay, very interesting. What exactly do you mean by belonging? And how is that differentiated between other concepts such as Heimat?
So in the case of my book, To Belong in Buenos Aires, the belonging is about in the new society. And so it seems to me that there's plenty of evidence that people are orienting their interest in the local or the new national and thinking of their futures in Argentina. And this is, I found particularly striking, and my book spends a lot of time looking at education, therefore children. And it seems in particular when they're talking about their children, they're very aware that their children belong in Argentina or that are Argentine. There's an opening quote from a poem in the first page of my book by this German immigrant, Leo Mirau, and he says, "Dear readers, follow me to the south, to the shores of the Rio de la Plata, my new homeland, or my new home and the fatherland of my children." And that kind of language, the fatherland of my children, also has implications for him, right? And has implications for immigrants themselves. And so in that sense, the belonging is very much about this process of adaptation or realizing sort of where they're spending their lives. I have this argument in the introduction of my book briefly, but I think it's really important in migration studies. We spend all this time talking about origins, and I think that in the Americas, when you talk about HIMAT, like there could be a HIMAT in the Central and Eastern European context, but in the case of the Americas, this idea of origins is very central, right? So immigrants, censuses talk about origins. It's how we measure where you're born, sort of as your most definitive category or something. This is sort of a methodological point of departure. And no one ever talks about where you die, but I would argue that where you die is, and even saying this is like some sort of radical idea, but that's way more important. If you leave a country at age 20 and die in a country at age 80, it's not your country of birth that matters, but your country of death. And so to reorient your sort of historical analysis to the future, of course, in the past, I think is methodologically very rich, and it makes us sort of understand migration in a very different way. And so in that sense, I have no interest in HIMAT. I know this is a central topic in German historiography, and it goes maybe from a 1945 and Central and Eastern European context, and then it can get extrapolated to the Americas. But what I've seen of German speakers in the Americas, and I have another book coming out this week about Canada, they're not talking about HIMAT. They're talking about their origins, sure. They're talking about senses of Germanness and their connections across the Atlantic Ocean, but they're also spending a lot of time talking about their belonging and their future.
Okay, interesting. Like, to what degree is belonging? So this isn't actually I'm riffing off of what you just said. To what degree is belonging also associated with the land that they go to? So HIMAT is definitely just a focus of the group themselves that are migrating. Belonging also seems to have this connection with, okay, it's both the group, but also where they're going and the reception to that. So, because you do talk about the kind of mixing of, well, there's lots of Argentine children or Spanish children who are going into German schools, and so the title of German school can be misleading. So there seems to be a lot of coalescence and assimilation, but it's not just Germans going and assimilating to Argentine society. It's also Argentine society kind of welcoming German migrations. So in your book, can you just kind of talk about that a little bit? The sense of belonging being more of two-sided, whereas HIMAT is more one-sided, if you understand my question.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of build on what you're saying, for example, so a German school in Buenos Aires, there could be, it's in fact called the German School of Buenos Aires. That was one of the older ones. And then they had other, neighborhood names, so Belgrano Schule and things like that. So if you look at the enrollment at those schools, there's a bunch of Germans, both immigrant children and then children of German-speaking immigrants. But there's a whole bunch of non-German speakers at those schools. And so in a sense, maybe also one of my methodological interests in this book, and maybe thinking about how this is an Argentine history, not a global German history, is that if a third of the students at a German school are not ethnically German, that's really interesting. And it's so often, or, if this was 10 or 20 years ago, we wouldn't pay any attention to that fact because our goal is to study the German school and the persistence of Germanness and things like that and their connections across the ocean. But that a third aren't even German and they're going to German school is interesting. And similarly, in the 1910 municipal census of Buenos Aires, they had data on statistics on children and the nationality of parents. And so again, on the one hand, if you've got a whole lot of ethnic persistence of Germans marrying Germans, they meet abroad and they marry Germans and then they send their kid to German school. But there's all this data about Germans not marrying Germans. And so I think it's also interesting, like, what's that about? Was that we have these Germans marrying Argentines or Spanish immigrants or Italian immigrants, and then getting married in Catholic ceremonies rather than Lutheran ceremonies. So this data includes their religion and their nationality. And so again, just to emphasize, even if this is a minority, that minority maybe tells us a lot about migration and transformation. So rather than focusing on 66%, let's focus on the 33% because it's on the margins that you can uncover important trends in history. And then, of course, over time, this becomes more and more important. And so again, rather than focusing on what seems like the most obvious way to study migration or to study Germans and Germany in the world. Let's focus on the least obvious parts, which also are contributing to our understanding of German migration or Germans in the world.
So maybe a little bit of a counterpoint. Isn't it also seen that German schools initially were for kind of constructing Germanness by German communities, but then over time they kind of became a part of the Imperial Germany's soft power promoting Germanness? So doesn't that shift also kind of explain why there's possibly more non-Germans in these schools as well, where they're there because now it's Imperial Germany trying to promote German as German culture as something beneficial to Latin American society?
Well, I mean, that is definitely a historiographic trend from German historiography. The one thing I just nuance on that is that most of these schools are founded already in this era of Weltpolitik, and so there's sort of almost all the schools are founded between the ones that I look at in my book in this period, 1880 to 1930. They're almost all founded after the 1890s and at the turn of the 20th century. So they're already being, as a point of departure, they're being found in this moment where there is this sort of cultural Außenpolitik of the German Empire, this soft power element of it, that is both either for there's a strong ethnic focus in that cultural foreign policy of the German Empire to keep Germans German, and I think they're more interested in keeping Germans than they are of making Argentines Germanophiles, although both of those things happen in their discussions of the role of German schools in 1905 in Buenos Aires or elsewhere in Latin America. But one thing I would add to that, so I looked at a lot of the financial reports of these schools. That was sort of another sort of methodological approach of the book, and they're receiving subsidies from the German state. And I would say historiographically, again from the German historiography perspective, those subsidies are taken as evidence of sort of what you've said, right? That this is an example of the German state expanding its influence over whether it's, sort of lost citizens or people of other backgrounds who are trying to make friends of Germany. But if you look more closely and think of them again as local institutions or as Argentine institutions, that funding and that influence, whatever that influence is coexisting with a whole other reality that seems to be far more important. So in the case of money and just pure numbers, the German government is funding sort of at most about 10% of the annual budgets of any of these schools in the Argentine capital, and anywhere in the interior, it's way less. So on the one hand, if you lose 10% of your budget, if you think of a modern institution, that if you were to lose it, that would have a significant. You'd be firing secretaries. You'd be not buying books anymore. But on the other hand, is 10% enough to buy you overwhelming influence on some other institution? I would say categorically no. And I think there's plenty of evidence in sort of the how the directors talk about the schools, how the teachers talk about the schools. They're not kowtowing to German influence. They are just happy to get the support as sort of like a tip. It's like, why not? This is a good thing, win-win kind of thing. Germany's happy that they're having this global footprint, particularly in capital cities, not in the interior. But the schools are happy because it comes with no strings attached. And the extra thing, and again, I think that focus on Germany's influence abroad and through schools and things like that overlooks the way more dominant influence of the Argentine state. So the Argentine state literally can close these schools at a whim. It is setting the curriculum far more. So the German government is sort of happily exporting pedagogical materials, but the Argentine government is happily demanding and successfully that they teach certain subjects, not only about Argentina, but in Spanish. So all these German schools are teaching way more in Spanish about Argentina than they are receiving money from the German state. So again, in terms of sort of methodology or influence, the focus of my book, and it's sort of in contrast to some of, I would say, recent historiography from Germany in the world, that Germany in the world is this background story, not the central narrative. And so that would be my sort of historiographical perspective and the argument in many ways of the book.
You've mentioned marriage records and financial records of the schools. I was curious because I'm going to be next year doing my year of research somewhere. What was the hardest part of the research for this book?
The book actually, a large part of the book comes from a dissertation, which was a comparison of German immigrants, German education, German religion in Argentina and Canada. So as I don't know if it was hard, but an important thing that sort of could be seen as hard is that I had to travel to 3 continents, right? So I was in Canada already. So it was the Canadian side of the research didn't require all sorts of travel, but it required me to spend a large part of a year in Buenos Aires doing research, and then a large part of, or then a whole summer the next year in German archives. So I mean, it was relying on archives in 3 continents, and I think the number in the dissertation introduction, I think I might have been 42 archives. So I don't think that's hard. It was enjoyable. It was rich to get all those perspectives. One thing that maybe was challenging, but also rewarding, so I don't remember this as being hard, is that particularly on the Argentine side of things, but no, I would say also on the Canadian side of things, I tried as much as possible to rely on private archives rather than national libraries or things like that. So I spent a lot of time in church basements, digging through boxes that aren't cataloged, or not only in the principal's office, looking through the annual reports, but that wasn't the hard part. But getting into the principal's office in Buenos Aires, you could say was hard. It required a certain finessing, a nice letter, asking nicely, knowing someone who maybe, if they say no the first time, you have to try again in a different angle. So that sort of almost anthropological practice to get into these private archives was maybe a challenge, or maybe just sort of the name of the game. And but then of course it led to really fruitful results of looking at things that also, I mean, I would say flatly contradict the sources that you see produced by the German state and that you could access easily in Berlin. So again, I don't think of that. I don't remember that as being hard, but definitely required money and financial support from various Canadian scholarships, and then the time to travel. And then taking it one step further to the book then, as I disassociated Canada from Argentina, and then a thing you'll see in the book is that there's all these, as when possible, I try to draw parallels between Germans and other groups. And so that required more archival research in Britain and France and Spain to draw sort of parallels. So it was sort of a mini version of the same project, just to find examples of British schools or French schools, Spanish mutual aid societies. So again, it required this kind of broad archival survey. But again, I thought of that as fun rather than hard. But of course, it required a certain logistics and financial support to be able to do it.
So with all this research, was there any one moment that was like an aha moment for you of like, oh, this encapsulates like what I'm trying to say or my research? Like how much of your standing viewpoint when you went into the research, how much did that change? Or did you pretty much know what you were going to write from the get-go?
The project definitely changed. I'm not sure if I have a very clear aha moment, but I was increasingly being drawn to things that seemed really important to the migrants themselves and their voices. And so things that I've already touched on, that there's really strong interest in their kids and their future. There's this really strong interest it's only a small part of the book, maybe 8 pages, but it also became an article separate from the book about the German hospital of Buenos Aires. And there was this overwhelming goal of the hospital, backed up by massive financial donations, tens of thousands of pesos a year, which is the equivalent of tens of thousands of German marks per year. So the exchange rate was 1 to 1.78, of providing charity to working class Germans. And there was a sort of discussion of obligation to members of the German stock. We have this obligation to help German immigrants. And this was something also repeated across ethnic groups. So the British did, the French did the exact same thing. So in a sense, I don't know if that was an aha moment, but was like, oh my goodness, this is the thing that I should be writing about. Was definitely something that emerged sort of in various chapters, or various thematic approaches of the book, that, oh my goodness, these people are really interested in their children having an Argentine fatherland, or, oh my goodness, look at the massive amounts of money being thrown at these projects. These are the things that tell the story of German Buenos Aires, education, religion, these things. So it's not this story of, do they care if the Weimar Republic has become a republic? I don't think anyone, comparatively, just based on words, ink spilled, way more people cared about children becoming Catholic, or the denominational makeup. They cared about religion and faith way more than they cared about whether the Weimar Republic was a republic or if the empire had fallen. And so I was having these sort of oh my goodness moments rather than aha moments, that the argument I need to be making is what matters to these immigrants rather than what matters based on state sources that you can find in public archives in Berlin. So these are, I don't know, I'm not going to call, I had never thought of them as aha moments, but definitely I need to do more to show this, to engage with historiography.
Okay. Well, speaking of the historiographies, because you've engaged with so many different ones, you kind of alluded to that yourself with having different perspectives in the archives, the private archives in Argentina, rather than the much more national archives of Berlin. What were like important differences did you notice from these different historiographies between maybe more the German historiographies focusing more on Germans in Buenos Aires versus like the Latin American or Argentine historiographies focusing on this immigrant but the main focus being in Buenos Aires?
Yeah, so the book, I think, centers migrants' voices, and as much as possible. So there's this other, I make a detour here. There's this problem that community leaders aren't very representative of communities. And in fact, what is a community if only 7% of, if you look at the membership of various kinds of community institutions, they don't add up to the number of people who fit in censuses, right? So there's a big disconnect between the voices that you're finding that are speaking for the community versus the reality of someone who has some relationship with German ethnicity or any other background. So one of my solutions to that was trying to look at least at as many kinds of institutions as possible that seem to attract large memberships, right? So churches, hospital associations, the people who receive care at hospitals, children at schools, these seem to be like getting us closer to, nowhere near the 100% number, but it gets us into this sort of 35% or 50% range of people I can find their names or their statistics of receiving services versus what the census says they are. So I'm trying to center migrant voices as much as possible. And in so doing, I sort of already alluded to how I think this disagrees with what German historiography is saying, but the migrant voices, of course, that's not a historiography. So I would say from how I think about the German historiography, there's all this wonderful work being done on Germany and the world and thinking about globalization and connections. And this is very helpful to build off of and to think about from as part of a story. And then what I want to add to that, though, is that the imperial fantasies are just fantasies, right? And they might have impact or influence, but that's not the story, right? So a study of Germans in Latin America should not be based on the imperial fantasies. Those imperial fantasies are just intersecting with much more local and national histories. But maybe in reverse, also Argentine historiography. So studies of migration in Argentina, I think, also rely a lot on state sources and elite discourse about migrants. So you could write a whole book about how people at the time talked about the dangers of migrants and health, or migrants and their supposed allegiances to countries of origin, and not just Germany, but also in the case of Argentina, there's all this discussion of the of connections with Italy, But again, if you look at the migrant voices, that doesn't seem to be what Germans in Argentina are saying or what Italians in Argentina are saying. And so I would maybe also like to think about how that focus that's disagreeing with German historiography, the focus on German migrant voices, is actually also disagreeing with Argentine historiography, right? And so if there's this concern about the Argentine nation being vulnerable, this is a thing being talked about by Argentine elites at the turn of the 20th century, and then how assimilation is an important goal or something that needs to be sort of confronted, and we need to do things in schools to assert the Argentineness of this multi-ethnic society. Well, read from the perspective of the migrants, they didn't seem all that subversive. They seemed very interested in the case of Germans, fostering Germanness and making their kids speak German, but also the thinking of Argentina as the fatherland of my children. So they talk about. There's no complaints about teaching Argentine subjects or teaching in Spanish in the case of the schools. There's no complaints about singing the Argentine national anthem. They also just want to sing the German national anthem at schools as well, right? So that point, that seems to be a genuine interest of immigrant teachers, and to a lesser extent, you could extrapolate to think the parents of children going to those schools. They wanted to sing both anthems in 1905. And I think that is a corrective to both how German historiography talks about German migrants abroad, and how Argentine historiography talks about immigrants in Argentine society or in Buenos Aires society. And so in that sense, I'm sort of, by centering these voices, it's hopefully adding to both historiographies at the same time.
So in your book, you really are getting at this idea of Germanness and kind of similarity versus differences between groups. So are Germans, can we really talk about them as the German community in Buenos Aires, or are they fractious where there's the German Lutheran community and then the German Catholic community? Can you just talk about that a little bit? What did you really think about this idea of Germanness, and how helpful is it actually to talk about as historians?
So I think from a migration studies perspective, and you think of whether in Argentina or in Brazil or Canada, United States, there is, from the perspective of historians of migration, a historiographic interest in pointing out how who speaks for the community, what is a community, and then maybe the next step is that there is no such thing as a community, right? That we've been relying on this category of analysis in a very flawed way. And I think that maybe Germany in the world historiography has maybe not taken that same methodological leap as migration studies historiography about the fractiousness of communities and who speaks for community and that kind of, which makes sense because we have different sort of interests and backgrounds and sort of the debates we're engaging with. And I would absolutely say that there was not one German community of Buenos Aires. You could start by saying, well, there was already a Lutheran and a Catholic community. There's this other community, which we should not call a community, the people who didn't care, right? The people who didn't want to be German, the people who arrived and got interested in speaking Spanish, then married an Italian and became a citizen and got a job working, whether it was on a farm or in a school or whatever. Those people are also part of a study of migration, right? And sort of think of the non-affiliated, or the people more than non-affiliated who sort of were disdainful, is also a helpful way to understand migration. A Brazilianist historian of migration, Jeffrey Lesser, says that we spend a lot of time talking about love, sort of patriotism, nationalism, this interest in countries of origin. But hate is an emotion that's very similar to love, right? Like it's sort of equal value in the opposite direction. And so he has spent, in one of his books, he talks about this Japanese Brazilian who hates Japanese Brazilians or hates the community and lives in Rio because he doesn't want to be connected to the community in Sao Paulo. And so we should spend more time thinking about the people who hate the community or don't want to have anything to do with the community as another way to understand German ethnicity and German migration in a given country. And so we'll say the haters, or the ones who are indifferent. I don't know if we can call them separate communities or just people that are also casting doubt on the very existence of the community. And then, of course, in a formal way, and this is an easy way, I think, to make this point, that there's German Catholics and German Lutherans who have sort of radically different opinions about the problems facing the community. And therefore, I think a proof that there's at least two. And then you have, say, German socialists. They even have, there's a German language socialist newspaper published in Buenos Aires in this time period. Surely they are a different community than German Catholics, right? And so if we can sort of chart through the institutional approach, which is sort of how community studies are always done, if we actually use their own methods, we can already undermine the very existence of communities and easily go from one to 5 or 6 communities. And then we think more broadly about, well, where are all these people that appear on a census but don't appear on in any of these community registries, right? And so I would definitely say there's no such thing as a German community on one level. We could say there's 3 or 4 or some number like that. But I think we should also think of this as even a methodological approach or analytical approach, that how is it helpful to talk about community? And I think it is helpful to talk about community. These are the formal institutions that also do things like interact with the German state or interact with the Argentine state. These are also things that are producing documents that as historians we can study, but we should just realize that this is only part of a history. If our goal is German migration or Germans in Argentina or Germany-Argentina connections or migrant connections with their country of origin or the region of origin. And so these sort of should all be part of our focus, and rather than focusing just on a community and thinking a bit back in time about Argentine historiography, so German Argentine historiography, the study of the German community of Argentina or Buenos Aires, fractures in community was something of interest, and in particular in the 1920s and 1930s and into the 1940s. Let's take it right up to the 1940s. So in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, a neutral country, it is a country that has both a very active pro-Nazi daily newspaper and a really active anti-Nazi daily newspaper. So in this 1939-45 moment, this is a wonderful example of a split community between two based on these two newspapers. And you have these two really strong groups really in favor of Germany and one really opposed to the Nazis. And then you could walk that back to also the 1920s, and is Weimar a good thing or is Weimar a bad thing? But as a point of departure, you're still sort of thinking in community frameworks. And even if you're talking about fracturing, you're focusing on formal institutions without reflecting on these other things that I've been saying.
Yeah, because I focus on studying the Mennonites, and I've kind of run into very similar problems where, to what degree can we study this as a group? Because the Mennonites are also very fractious. They have something some Mennonite historians call the Anabaptist disease, which is every time they have some sort of disagreement, half the church splits and forms a different church, and they really recognize that that's their own community. And so they're very locally centered, very fractious, but there's also a usefulness to describe them as Mennonite. They have kind of a historical trajectory. And there are also moments of coming together that is also, I mean, that can only exist if there is some semblance of sameness between these two groups. And so reading the book, I was also kind of thinking about that with these German communities. I mean, an individual's identity can also be multifaceted. So I would suppose a community's identity can also be contested and multifaceted. But you really made me think about the degrees to which German as a separate community is useful to study versus German as kind of a pattern of migrations that is very similar to very other mutual aid societies and things like that, that there's lots of patterns that are both cross-ethnic, cross-religious. So yeah, I thought that was a very good point you made in your book, kind of drawing these out.
The example of Mennonites is, so I'm reflecting whether on books I've read about Mennonites in either Canada or Latin America, and to a lesser extent the United States, and then the time I've spent in Winnipeg. That, I mean, this conversation and say the historiography in which we've been sort of getting around is using this term, the German community of Buenos Aires, whereas your example of sort of an ethno-religious group, then how you then define a community or a fracture within a community, was at the local congregational level. And so obviously a single church on a street or in a field is a community, right? That's sort of a thing about churches. But in that context, you're not extrapolating and say all the Mennonites who live in southern Manitoba are a community, because instead you're using the word community to talk about a local congregation. So if you take that same, okay, so that's how you're using the word community in this case. Why are we using it in a different way in the case of Germans in Buenos Aires, right? Like, of course there is not only a Lutheran community, there's a Belgrano Lutheran community. There is, there's community means many things. I mean, I live in an apartment building that has a sense of community, and people, I think 100 years ago, had all these senses of communities at the same time as well. And then to build a whole historiography around the very concept of the German community, or then our contribution will say, well, in fact, it's two communities, seems to be missing other important ways of how humans interact both today and in the past.
Yeah, but to push back on that a little bit, there's also a degree to which Mennonites, like they obviously are much more locally centered, and their community is much more locally centered. I think that's kind of natural for humans. But there's also these transnational groups like the Mennonite Central Committee, mm-hmm. that also has a tendency, it's like there's a gravity to these larger organizations that all these Mennonite groups, even if they necessarily don't associate with them theologically or whatever, they're still willing to accept financial support or things like that. So there are also these ties that connect these communities together. Lots of the time, kinship networks, where you'll have, it's very frequent with a Mennonite family in Winnipeg having a cousin in Bolivia, another one in Belize, in two separate communities, and they might not agree theologically, or they might not consider themselves necessarily of the same community, but when they visit, they let them stay at their house. And so there's also these interspersings of kinship networks. There's also networks of religion, also networks with the Mennonites of networks of Germanness. Like, so a lot of Mennonites would say they are German, some Mennonites would say they aren't, and sometimes they tap into German networks. So I guess I even am using a different term. I would say network versus community. So maybe that's like we'd start talking about German networks rather than German communities. I think that would be more useful.
Yeah, well, if you word search my book, I'm sure the concept of community somehow emerged. Although I think at some moments I am trying to sort of suggest it's not a homogeneous thing or a set category. But the other term I think I use way more is ethnicity. And so people's understanding of ethnicity. I also actually, if you word search, you will not find, I hope, the word ethnic identity. So I'm not trying to find the true definition of what German ethnic identity is. I'm talking about in all these instances how people think about their German ethnicity in sort of relational ways. And I think these examples, right, that you visit a cousin or someone of a common sort of Mennonite background, but in Bolivia and you can stay at their house. This kind of network thing that goes on, that might be about a shared understanding of Mennoniteness or ethno-religious connections, but that's not about a community, right? And again, so I'm just sort of challenging this idea that we should think of this as a category of analysis. And related, there's this German word, Deutschtum, that when you translate English, maybe depends on the historian, depends on the generation, we either use the word Germanness or Germandom. Mm-hmm. And in the introduction of my book, I say these actually are two different words in English, right? So kingdom, it's a sort of if you think of these other doms, Christendom, kingdom, Germandom, these are sort of entities, right? Whereas Germanness is a bit more like the word ethnicity. And so the translation of Deutschtum, and when someone says Deutschtum, sometimes they're talking about, like, there's a book called Deutschtum in Argentinian, right? And this is the collective sense of the word. But sometimes when they say the word Deutschtum, they're just talking about a kid being lost from Germandom, they say. It's the Germanness of people that also matters. And so thinking about how that word should actually be translated, or is translated in two ways, and what the two English words actually mean rather than just the English word for Deutschtum, I think might be another helpful way to think about the fluidity of ethnicity and the various networks and scales that humans have. And even if it is various communities, overlapping communities, it's in these sort of relational ways.
Okay, interesting. Okay, just one final question. Besides your own book, is there any other historiographical or just history monograph that you think more historians should either be aware about or be reading?
I think that's a very tough question. And the first thing I did was look behind me to my bookshelf here. And the go-to that I'm going to use to answer this question is, I'm just teaching a seminar next term called Migration in the Americas, and I've just picked 5 books that I want history majors to read. And so the one that comes to mind is a book that I really like is called Migrant Marketplaces by Liz Zanoni. And it's a comparison of Italians in Buenos Aires and New York City. And I think this is a great book. Students also think it's a great book. And so I'm almost maybe deliberately choosing that because it's not about German studies, right? It's a good book about migration. It's a good book about food and thinking about food as an important thing to understand migration. From the Germanist perspective, I think it's also a good book because it talks about these transatlantic connections to another country that actually has kind of a lot in common in terms of cultural foreign policy, whether it's Germany or Italy or chambers of commerce foreign policy. And so I think it's a good book that makes us think about, we could make scholars of German migration think about similarities. And if the next book you read is about Italians or about Japanese, for example, that might be another way to think through the topics of your research about German migrants in X country in maybe new ways.